All right, so this lecture should help you work through your paper this weekend. I'm gonna go through this. It's a short PowerPoint, like 10 slides, so I'm gonna go through it pretty quickly here. But hopefully, this will give you some perspective and help you better answer the question. Talking about really like the development of the Soviet Union um, and the substantial changes that are going to happen in the Soviet Union, really in the transfer of power from Lenin to Stalin. All right, so let's jump into it. So, um, where we left off on the last lecture was the end of the Russian Civil War after the Bolshevik Revolution, which is going to that Civil War is going to last about 3 years, and really about 1920, the Bolsheviks are going to gain control of the state. Um, and the problem is that like once that um, Civil War kind of dies down, there's these continued pockets of like rebellion, and though it's not like a full blown Civil War anymore, um, Lenin is realizing that many of like his war communism that he instituted um, was sort of exasperating economic problems and causing these little pockets of rebellion. And so what Lenin does is he very wisely moves away from like true full-blown communism and introduced what he called the new economic policy, which incorporated some communism and some capitalism into the Soviet economy. Um, and so under this new economic policy, um, the government wasn't going to seize surplus grains so peasants could sell their extra produce on the open market, which incentivized peasants to grow more food, which obviously is a good thing. Like small non-essential manufacturing was allowed to kind of run by themselves without government interference, and were allowed to sort of keep manage and keep their profits. So if they could make a lot of money, they could keep it. Um, Now, importantly, like so those are like varying degrees of capitalism there, um, but importantly, like with regards to the most important sort of heavy industries like banking and finance and railroads, so like basically it's steel, oil, finances, and railroads. All of that stuff was still controlled by the state, and what ends up happening is ends up being tremendously successful. Um, and so from 1921 to 1928, when Stalin starts his first 5-year plan, Lenin's new economic policy is very successful in the Soviet Union. Um, so you know just understand that Lenin's new economic policy, when we're looking at this, the important thing to realize is it's not true like full-blown communism. It's some of it is communist, and some of it's like the infusion of some capitalism into it made it very successful. All right, so during these new economic policies, or with the new economic policies, Russia is going to sort of grow past their pre-World War I levels for the first time. Workers are going to have shorter working hours. They're going to have better working conditions. And the state's going to relax its censorship and use of terrorism. So, like things, not only economically do things get better, um, but sort of like socially, the state can relax its control over people as they get some prosperity. And with prosperity, you have less agitation of state control, and so on and so on. So, what's going to happen though is that Lenin actually dies in 1924, and when Lenin dies, he didn't openly choose a successor. Um, and what's going to happen is that Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky are going to sort of battle for control over the next couple years. Um, and what's interesting is that like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've had more access to these documents by early Soviet leaders. And what's interesting is like they published Lenin's personal journal. And Lenin actually wrote very sort of disparagingly about Stalin and said that Stalin was unfit to rule and like was very critical of him. But what ends up happening is that by 1927, Stalin becomes sort of leader in this sort of two-horse race for who's going to be the next Soviet leader. And really the thing that allows Stalin to sort of emerge as the front runner is that Stalin really advocated for like a Russia first model. So, part of like the idea of communism going back to Marx is that like Marx believed that like communism was going to be like a worldwide revolution of workers, and that like really Marx honestly believed um, that like nationalism was this sort of like made up thing to try to separate working class people and to keep working class people down. And so he said, like communism is going to erase those sort of fake nationalistic lines and bring workers together. Stalin didn't believe in that. So Stalin wanted to focus on Russia first and like build Russia up. Whereas like Trotsky was more of like an idealist and like a maybe more like true Marxist, and thought that like this is going to be a perpetual revolution, and then that Russia should be helping agitate communist revolutions all over the world. Um, and so because of Stalin's maybe more realistic approach, he's the one that consolidates power, and by 1929, Stalin really has complete control of the state. He exiles Trotsky, and then has him assassinated later on. Um, so just kind of understand it. I mean, once Stalin gets control, um, he's gonna he's gonna purge basically all of Lenin's supporters. So once Stalin is sort of in power, any of Lenin's old political leaders or allies, I mean, they all disappear or die. Some of them were put on trial, like staged trials, to make it look like they were getting due process, but many of them just were executed. Um, Stalin's first 5-year plan is started in 1928. What Stalin had in mind is that he was going to do two back-to-back 5-year plans. So, like Stalin said that, like within 10 years, the Soviet Union needs to sort of catch up to where Western countries were, or that Russia would be permanently left behind. And so his objective was to increase industrial output by 200 to 300% and agricultural output by like 150%. And what's incredible is that like they outdo those very ambitious goals. And so, with regards to like industrial output, like steel production was up 400%, oil was up 300%. There's like cities grow massively, and so like from an economic standpoint, if you're just looking at production levels, it was enormously successful. Now the problem is that they're focused so much on just like producing materials and quantity, that like the quality of goods was very substandard. Um, we'll talk about eventually that like they're so focused on like mass production, but not about like developing processes that will be like successful in the long term. Like they don't utilize interchangeable parts and things like small things like that. Um, and so like the quality of goods is going to be lacking. And then also like just the standard of living for Soviets didn't rise, because like one of the things with communism is that like everyone is going to do well enough to be happy and survive, but no one's going to be doing so well that they have like extra and they have really nice things. And so like the standard of living in the Soviet Union, the quality of products is going to remain low, and that's like I point that out now. And remember that like when we start talking about during the Cold War, that's one of the things that really sticks out between the sort of Cold War realities of the Soviet Union versus like Western capitalistic societies. Um, One of the things that is very, I would say, very unsuccessful, obviously because of the amount of death, but just from I mean, even if you take out the fact that millions of people perish because of these policies, um, like the collectivization of agriculture just not successful even from an economic standpoint. So, like what Lenin attempts to do is he tries to get rid of these, like with the peasants had a certain independence from the state for a variety of reasons. One, I mean, because Russia's so geographically large, like the space between them and government offices often like enabled some level of independence. But also remember that like Lenin's new economic policy, the NEP, had allowed them to have independence in sort of how many crops they grew, and then be able to keep their surplus crops and sell them on the open market. And so like what had happened, and to some extent, is that there was this like middle class peasantry that had developed. Um, and that sounds, that's like an oxymoron, middle class peasant. Um, like, they're very, they're the poor, they're in the poorest class, but they're like the upper class of the poorest people. Um, and so what Lenin does is he wants to remove these they are called kulaks. Um, and so he kills their animals, he burns their crops, or sorry, the kulaks in opposition to Stalin's attempted control, like they protested and they killed off their animals, and they burned their own crops, and they were growing just enough food for themselves. And so Stalin couldn't effectively, at least initially, get these people under control. I mean, so you see the stat here that in 1933, only 60% of farming was done on collective farms in Russia. And so initially, in the short term, like Stalin has trouble bringing these people under control, but by 1938, 93% are going to be on collective farms. Um, and so, eventually these policies are going to produce enough food for Russia, but in this collectivization process is in the short term um, very unsuccessful. It leads to um, at least 10 million people dying from either starvation or from like being killed. And some people say that like up to possibly 50 million people died. And so like this is like, and I think that's probably too high, but I mean, just the fact that it could potentially go that high shows you just how horrible these changes were to Russia, and the sort of very serious effects and strains it put on the food supply. Um, Now, one of the things about the collectivization is like Stalin could be really brutal to these farmers because most of Stalin's power was derived from the fact that he needed to have the urban workers on his side. Um, and so, like, once they're able to produce enough food to ensure that urban workers have enough, like, that's way more important, sort of politically and economically for Stalin. The other thing that Stalin is going to do, like, and to a much greater degree than Lenin is going to do, is that he's takes advantage of the power of propaganda. And this is very similar to what Hitler does in Nazi Germany. Is that he's going to use new technology. So like, you know, government propaganda that looks like advertising, like modern advertising. They're going to use the radio. New movies. When movies come out, they're going to use movies as government propaganda. Um, and so, like Stalin is just much like Hitler is like a master of propaganda. So they're going to have like all these different variations of like state-controlled newspapers, radio, programming, films, and all it is just like glorifying like Soviet people, the Soviet model, communism. It's going to promote Stalin, and like in all instances, these media outlets are going to portray America and the West as like the great evils of the world, and especially once the Great Depression sets in, they're going to want to punctuate like, look, the Western world is crumbling. This great country, the United States, they're struggling. It's falling apart. Communism is doing well. It's strong, and like so, it's like all they have some added ammunition there with the Great Depression for um, propaganda purposes. So he's also going to get rid of religion in the Soviet Union, and he wants to get rid of Christianity and the Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union. He also creates a young organization to indoctrinate young people. This is like the Nazi youth program in um, Nazi Germany. One of the really interesting things to just show you some examples of like how they they alter like Soviet censorship and Soviet propaganda. Um, like as Stalin has people killed, he was removing them from pictures. Um, it just it shows the extent to which that they were really conscious of propaganda and the power of pictures and media. And you can kind of look at um, these different pictures that show that. One of the important changes that comes with this is that Stalin really does institute much more of like socialistic social changes, I guess you could say, even though I don't think he's very Marxist. So like under Stalin, they're going to create old age pensions. They're going to create free medical care, state-controlled education and free education, and daycare for kids was all covered under the state. Okay, which obviously people were happy about. The Russian Revolution is going to immediately proclaim the complete equality of rights for women, even though society was slow to reflect this equality of rights under Stalin. The government, like the state, is going to push for more like women's equality, even though, like I said, like the actual society is maybe slow to change in that regard. Um, and so, like during the 1930s, you see women urged to work outside the home to help grow the Soviet economy, and many are going to sort of end up in professional jobs and in universities, especially. Um, we're gonna talk later about like more of like Stalin's changes in the 1930s that kind of lead into World War II. But one of the other things that you need to recognize here is that during the 1930s, the Soviet Union goes through what's called the Great Terror. And so, like, really starting in 1934, Stalin is going to become increasingly totalitarian and authoritarian, and he's going to use terror to consolidate his control and increase his power in the Soviet Union. Um, and so, like, he basically creates the sort of our like modern conception of what the Soviet Union was, is where like either you were for the state, then this like totalitarian regime, or you died. And so, the use of like gulags, like the forced labor slave camps, like out in Siberia, millions of people are just going to be killed directly and assassinated. There's over 8 million arrests are going to be made as part of this like terror campaign to basically force people to go along with the state, or just like they would be taken care of. And so this is also the beginnings of the KGB. And so Stalin's spying not only on his own people, but this is also when Stalin starts trying to place KGB agents all over the world, to try to like spy on other countries. And so, this is like total totalitarian government, creating total fear and obedience to Stalin and the sort of Soviet regime. This is the last slide. So I really like the big thing here that I really want you to get out of this is being able to compare like Lenin, though Lenin has sort of a brief stint in power, but being able to compare like the changes that Lenin made versus like the changes that Stalin's going to make, and then like be able to analyze which of those changes actually is more Marxist, and sort of like go and how strongly both like Lenin and Stalin tie into like just the way in which like Marx envisioned communism from the start.